An elderly man was abandoned in a nursing home by his daughters, who were interested in the inheritance. When the will was read, the daughters were shocked to discover what they had inherited. In the luxurious Thompson mansion in Newport, the afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, illuminating a scene far from harmonious. Walter Thompson, a 78-year-old man with gray hair and tired eyes, sat in his favorite armchair, surrounded by his 3 daughters. What should have been a peaceful family gathering had turned into a heated argument about money. "Dad, you need to understand," Amanda, the eldest daughter, said impatiently. "The mansion is a burden for you now. Selling it would be the most sensible decision." Brenda, the middle daughter, agreed. "Think of all the good we could do with that money. My Senate campaign, for example." Caroline, the youngest, interrupted. "Or expanding my fashion brand. Imagine the legacy you'd leave behind, Dad." Walter looked from one daughter to the other, his heart heavy. He didn't see love in their eyes, only greed for his fortune. When had his little girls turned into these greedy women? Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through Walter's chest. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His vision blurred, and he felt his body slip from the chair. "Dad!" Amanda shouted, finally noticing something was wrong. Chaos erupted in the room. Carolyn rushed to call an ambulance while Brenda awkwardly tried to help her father. Minutes later, which felt like hours, the ambulance arrived. The paramedics worked quickly, placing Walter on the stretcher. The sisters followed to the hospital, each in her own car. In the emergency room, doctors were rushing around. "It's a stroke," one of them informed the daughters. But instead of worrying about their father's health, their first thought was about the will. "Did he sign the new papers?" Amanda whispered to Brenda. "I don't think so," Brenda replied, biting her lip. "This is a disaster." Caroline, meanwhile, was already on the phone with her lawyer. After hours of waiting, the doctor came out of the emergency room. "Your father is stable, but he will need constant care. I recommend a specialized nursing home." The sisters exchanged glances. It was Caroline who spoke up. "We know the perfect place, Golden Sunset." Days later, Walter was transferred to Golden Sunset, a luxury nursing home on the outskirts of town. It was there that he met Sarah Matthews, a 35-year-old nurse with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Welcome, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, helping him settle into his room. "I'm here to take care of you." Walter just nodded, still unable to speak clearly due to the stroke. But in Sarah's eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: genuine compassion. In the weeks that followed, the daughters' visits became increasingly rare. Amanda was busy with her real estate projects, Brenda with her political campaign, and Caroline with her fashion brand. Sarah became the constant presence in Walter's life. She read to him, helped him with physical therapy, and most of all, she listened. Slowly, Walter began to open up, sharing stories from his life through slow words and gestures. One day, Sarah found Walter looking out the window, a tear running down his face. "Mr. Thompson, what's wrong?" she asked gently. Walter turned to her, his eyes filled with sadness. "My life, my legacy, all wrong," he managed to say. Sarah took his hand. "It's never too late to change, Mr. Thompson. It's never too late to do the right thing." At that moment, an idea began to form in Walter's mind. An idea that would change everything, not just for him, but for everyone around him. While Walter was adjusting to his new life at Golden Sunset across town, a middle-aged man rummaged through a dusty box. Jack Morrison, a retired detective, pulled out a yellowed folder with the name Thompson handwritten on it. "I knew I had kept this somewhere," Jack murmured to himself, his eyes gleaming with renewed determination. Jack had always suspected there was something off about Walter Thompson's business dealings. Now, with the news of the real estate tycoon's stroke circulating around town, he felt it was time to reopen his private investigation. At Golden Sunset, Sarah continued her daily care routine for Walter. She noticed that, despite his physical improvement, he seemed increasingly pensive and melancholic. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah suggested one day, "have you ever thought about writing your memoirs? Many patients find it helps with the recovery process." Walter looked at her, considering the idea. After a moment, he slowly nodded. In the weeks that followed, Walter began dictating his memoirs to Sarah. At first, they were light-hearted stories about his childhood and the early days of his career, but gradually, darker revelations began to surface. "I wasn't a good man, Sarah," Walter confessed one day, his voice trembling. "I did things I'm not proud of." Sarah listened intently without judgment as Walter spoke of shady business deals, bribes, and decisions that had harmed many people over the years. One sunny afternoon, Sarah was pushing Walter's wheelchair through the nursing home gardens when a young man approached them. "Hey, Sarah," the young man greeted with a warm smile. "Kevin, what a surprise to see you here," Sarah responded, her cheeks blushing slightly. Kevin was Jack Morrison's son and worked as an architect for Amanda, Walter's eldest daughter. He and Sarah had crossed paths a few times at the nursing home, and a mutual attraction was growing between them. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see how things were," Kevin explained, giving Walter a gentle look. As the three of them chatted, Walter observed the interaction between Sarah and Kevin. There was a clear chemistry between them, and it brought a rare smile to the elderly man's face. Elsewhere, at the Thompson mansion, the three sisters gathered to discuss the latest developments. "Have you heard what the staff at the nursing home are saying?" Amanda asked, her voice laced with concern. "Apparently, Dad is writing his memoirs." Brenda turned pale. "Memoirs? That can't be good." Not Caroline, who had been staring out the window, turned to face her sisters. "What exactly do you think he's going to reveal?" "You know perfectly well, Caroline," Amanda retorted. "If he talks about, well, you know me, we can kiss the inheritance, the reputation, everything goodbye." Caroline frowned, a flicker of doubt crossing her eyes. "But what if this is good for him? Maybe it's a way for him to make peace with the past." Amanda and Brenda stared at Caroline as if she had grown a second head. "Since when do you care about Dad's feelings?" Brenda asked, incredulous. Caroline shrugged, suddenly feeling uncomfortable. "I'm just thinking out loud." Back at the nursing home, Walter finished another dictation session with Sarah. He looked at the nurse who had become his confidant. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "thank you for listening, for not judging me." Sarah smiled gently. "We all make mistakes, Mr. Thompson. What matters is what we do to make them right." Walter nodded, deep in thought. Sarah's words echoed in his mind, fueling an idea that had been growing inside him, an idea that could change everything. The tension in the director's office at Golden Sunset was palpable. Caroline Thompson, dressed in a designer suit and high heels, tapped her foot impatiently as the director stared at her, dumbfounded. "Miss Thompson," he said, nervously adjusting his glasses, "we simply can't stop your father from writing his memoirs. That would be unethical and illegal." Caroline leaned over the desk, her eyes blazing. "Listen carefully," she hissed. "If these writing sessions don't stop immediately, I'll sue this place until there's not even a doormat left. Got it?" The director swallowed hard, but stood his ground. "I'm sorry, but we can't comply with your request." Frustrated, Caroline stormed out. In the hallway, her phone rang. It was Amanda. "The doctor called." Amanda's voice sounded worried. "Dad's blood pressure is out of control. They think it could be another stroke." Caroline's heart raced, not out of concern for her father, but for what this could mean for the inheritance. "I'm on my way," she replied, rushing to the elevator. In Walter's room, Sarah monitored his vital signs with concern. Walter, pale and gasping for breath, gripped her hand. "Sarah," he whispered, "I need to see George Hawkins, my lawyer." Sarah hesitated. "Mr. Thompson, you need to rest." Walter squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Please, Sarah, it's important." Seeing the determination in his eyes, Sarah nodded. Quietly, she made the call. Hours later, after his daughters had left following a tense visit, George Hawkins slipped into Walter's room. The elderly lawyer, a longtime friend of Walter's, listened closely as his client explained his intentions. "Are you sure about this, Walter?" George asked, raising his eyebrows. Walter nodded. "More than ever, George. It's time to do the right thing." Meanwhile, in his makeshift office, Jack Morrison pored over old documents with growing excitement. "I knew it," he muttered, holding up a yellowed piece of paper. "Tax fraud, right here." Without wasting time, Jack contacted a journalist he knew. Within hours, the first headlines about financial irregularities in the Thompson empire began circulating online. Kevin was in Amanda's office when the news broke. He watched his boss panic, yelling into the phone at her press advisors. A storm of emotions flooded him. On one hand, he felt loyal to Amanda. She had given him a unique opportunity, trusting him more than any other employee. His professional success owed much to her. On the other hand, there was Sarah. His heart raced just thinking about her. Though his love for her was still almost secret, Kevin knew Sarah wouldn't approve of any attempt to cover up the truth. And then there was his father, Jack. Kevin knew it was him who had leaked the news, though Amanda had no idea. His respect for his father's hard work and integrity weighed heavily on his conscience. "Kevin," Amanda shouted, snapping him out of his thoughts. "I need you to call all our contacts. We have to bury this." Kevin swallowed hard, the inner conflict written all over his face. Professional loyalty, budding love, or family integrity? The decision he made now could change everything. At Golden Sunset, Caroline returned later, this time not to threaten, but to talk to Sarah. She found the nurse in the garden. "How is he?" Caroline asked, her voice softer than usual. Sarah looked at her in surprise. "Stable for now. Do you want to see him?" Caroline shook her head, sitting down on a nearby bench. To her own surprise, she began to talk. "You know, I wasn't always like this," she said, looking out at the horizon. "There was a time when I actually cared. But in this family, well, you learn that feelings are a weakness." Sarah listened in silence, seeing for the first time the vulnerability behind Caroline's tough exterior. "Sometimes," Caroline continued, her voice almost a whisper, "I wonder if there's still time to change, to be different." Sarah placed a comforting hand on Caroline's shoulder. "There's always time, Caroline. Always." The two women sat there in silence as the sun set over Golden Sunset. Inside the nursing home, Walter rested, unaware of the storms brewing around him, about to change the course of many lives forever. The day dawned tense at Golden Sunset. The three Thompson sisters arrived early, determined to talk to their father about the recent newspaper headlines. Walter's room had become a verbal battlefield. "Dad, you need to deny these accusations," Amanda demanded, her sharp voice echoing off the walls. Brenda, anxious, agreed. "My campaign is at risk. You can't stay silent." Caroline, recalling her conversation with Sarah, remained quiet, watching her father with a conflicted expression. Walter, tired and pale, tried to respond, but his daughters kept interrupting him. The pressure mounted with every passing second. Suddenly, Walter clutched his chest, his face twisted in pain. "Sarah," he managed to murmur before collapsing onto the bed. Chaos erupted. Sarah rushed into the room, screaming for help. The sisters, panicking, backed away. "Heart attack," Sarah informed the doctors, who arrived in a hurry. "Get the emergency room ready." As the medical team frantically worked to stabilize Walter, the three sisters found themselves in the hallway, dazed. "The documents," Amanda suddenly said. "We need to make sure everything is in order in case. She didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood. Within minutes, the three were running to their cars, more concerned about paperwork than their father's condition. Sarah, watching the scene, felt a mix of anger and sadness. It was at that moment she made a decision. "Miss Thompson," she called, stopping Caroline in her tracks. "There's something you all need to know. Your father, he finished his memoirs." Caroline's face went pale. "What? Where are they?" "They're safe," Sarah answered firmly, "and they contain everything." The news spread among the sisters like wildfire. The panic was palpable. They knew those memoirs could change everything. Hours passed. Walter was stabilized, but he had slipped into a coma. The doctors weren't sure if he would wake up. In the midst of the confusion, Jack Morrison appeared at the hospital. He pulled Sarah aside into a quiet corner. "I know you're close to Walter," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. "You need to see this." He showed Sarah documents proving tax fraud committed by Walter years ago. Sarah's world spun. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you need to know the truth about the man you're protecting," Jack replied. Sarah remained silent, overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. She had known about Walter's mistakes, but seeing them documented was different. A moral dilemma tore at her. At that moment, Kevin appeared. Seeing Sarah visibly shaken, he led her to a nearby bench. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked, concerned. Sarah hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Kevin, that man, he's your father, isn't he?" Kevin nodded, surprised. "How did you—" "He showed me evidence against Walter," Sarah explained. "I'm confused." Kevin took her hand. "Sarah, my father is an honorable man, but I can't interfere with his work, you understand? That doesn't change how I feel about you." The two sat there, hands intertwined, finding comfort in each other amidst the chaos. Meanwhile, the media ramped up its coverage. Speculation about the Thompson empire dominated the news. Walter's company's stock prices plummeted. In the hospital room, Walter lay still, unaware of the turmoil his past actions had unleashed. Sarah, torn between her loyalty to Walter and the truth she had just uncovered, watched the heart monitor, wondering what the future held for them all. The Thompson sisters in their respective offices scrambled desperately to control the damage. But as more details leaked, it became clear that a storm was only just beginning. And at the center of this hurricane, a man in a coma held secrets that could change everything. The next day, George Hawkins's law firm became the unlikely battleground for the Thompson sisters. Amanda, Brenda, and Carolyn stared at each other with fierce looks, the tension thick in the air. "We need to act now," Amanda said, slamming her hand on the table. "While Dad is in a coma, we have to secure our share." Brenda nodded, anxious. "My campaign is sinking. I need that money more than ever." Caroline, however, seemed hesitant. "Shouldn't we wait? He could wake up at any moment." "Wake up," Amanda laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Caroline, be realistic. Even if he wakes up after this scandal, the empire is crumbling. We need to save whatever we can." Amanda's words sparked a glimmer of greed in the other's eyes. Within minutes, they were plotting ways to claim their share of the inheritance, completely forgetting about their father's critical condition. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Sarah continued her vigil by Walter's side. She was startled by Amanda's arrival. "Sarah, dear," Amanda said, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "can we talk in private?" In a secluded corner, Amanda got straight to the point. "How much do you want for my father's memoirs?" Sarah was speechless. "What? They're not for sale, Miss Thompson." Amanda chuckled, pulling out a checkbook. "Come on, everyone has a price. Name yours." Sarah felt her blood boil. "I'm sorry, but there's no amount of money in the world that would make me betray your father's trust." Frustrated, Amanda stomped off, muttering threats under her breath. Sarah barely had time to recover from that encounter when Brenda appeared. "I hear you're causing problems," Brenda said, her tone menacing. "You know, I have powerful friends. It would be a shame if this hospital lost its license, don't you think?" Sarah felt a chill but held her ground. "Are you threatening me, Miss Thompson?" Brenda smiled coldly. "Just stating facts. Think about it." That night, when Sarah finally went home to rest, she didn't notice a slim figure sneaking down the hospital hallway. With her heart racing, Caroline slipped into Walter's room. "Sorry, Dad," she whispered, beginning to rummage through drawers and cabinets in search of the memoirs. Suddenly, the door opened. Kevin walked in, surprised to see Caroline. "What are you doing here?" he asked, suspicious. Caroline froze, her hand just inches away from a folder that might contain the memoirs. For a moment, she saw the disappointment in Kevin's eyes, and something inside her broke. Slowly, she backed away. I just wanted to check on him," she lied, quickly leaving the room. The next day, Sarah met Kevin at the hospital cafe. Exhausted and stressed, she broke down in tears. "They're pressuring me, Kevin," she sobbed. "I don't know how much longer I can take it." Kevin embraced her, feeling his heart race as she leaned into him. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. I'm here for you." Meanwhile, the media continued its relentless attack. New leaks emerged daily, each more damaging than the last. Walter's once unshakable reputation was now in tatters. The stocks of the Thompson companies were plummeting. Business partners were publicly distancing themselves. The empire Walter spent a lifetime building was falling apart before everyone's eyes. Amidst this chaos, Walter remained in a coma, oblivious to the war raging around him. Sarah, determined to protect her patient and friend, found herself at the center of a storm that threatened to tear everything apart. As night fell over the city, the three Thompson sisters, each in their own homes, planned their next moves. The battle for the inheritance was far from over, and they were willing to do whatever it took to come out on top. Sarah, sitting by Walter's bedside, held his cold hand. "Please, Mr. Thompson," she whispered, "wake up. They need you now more than ever." But Walter remained still, his future and the futures of everyone around him hanging by a thread. Kevin walked through the corridors of Amanda's office, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. As he passed the meeting room, a low conversation caught his attention. He recognized Amanda's voice along with that of some lawyers. "We need to invalidate any new will," Amanda was saying. "Use every legal resource possible. If necessary, we can claim he wasn't of sound mind." Kevin's heart raced. He knew he couldn't remain silent in the face of such manipulation. Without thinking twice, he rushed to the hospital. Sarah was checking Walter's vital signs when Kevin burst into the room, breathless. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he said, closing the door behind him. "Amanda is planning to contest any new will. She wants to use legal means to invalidate Mr. Thompson's wishes." Sarah turned pale. "Kevin, you could lose your job for telling me this." Kevin took her hands. "Some things are more important than a job." At that moment, Jack Morrison walked into the room, interrupting the intimate moment between Sarah and Kevin. "Sarah, may I speak with you privately?" Jack asked, then noticed his son. "Kevin, what are you doing here?" Kevin straightened up, visibly uncomfortable. "Hi, Dad. I came to check on Mr. Thompson." Jack cast a suspicious glance between his son and Sarah, clearly sensing there was more to the story. "I see," he said slowly. "Well, I need to speak with Sarah privately. We can talk later, son." Kevin nodded, casting a last worried look at Sarah before reluctantly leaving her and Jack alone. "I've uncovered more about Walter's past," Jack began, pulling some papers from his briefcase. He didn't just commit tax fraud, he also bribed politicians and judges. Sarah listened carefully, her face a mask of neutrality. Inside, she already knew many of these details through Walter's memories, but she kept her professional silence. "Jack," she said softly, "I appreciate your concern, but my duty is to care for Mr. Thompson, not to judge him." Jack frowned, clearly frustrated by Sarah's lack of reaction. He didn't know that deep down, she only wished for peace for Walter and herself, longing to return to her quiet routine at work. As Jack left, Sarah looked at Walter, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Suddenly, Walter's eyes opened. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah exclaimed, rushing to call the doctors. In the following hours, the hospital turned into a frenzy of activity. His daughters were notified, the media gathered outside, and the doctors ran a series of tests. To everyone's surprise, Walter not only woke up, but seemed determined. "I want to make an announcement," he told George Hawkins, who had arrived in a hurry. "A public reading of my will and my memories." The news spread like wildfire. The three Thompson sisters panicked. "We can't let this happen," Amanda declared, already on the phone with her lawyers. Brenda agreed, planning to use her political connections to try to stop the event. Carolyn, however, remained silent. Her father's words echoed in her mind. A public reading. What could he reveal? What had they become? While her sisters schemed, Caroline stepped away, finding a quiet corner in the hospital garden. She looked at her well-manicured hands, at her diamond ring, and suddenly, everything felt empty. "What have we become?" she murmured to herself. "Are we really this selfish and materialistic?" Meanwhile, Walter's empire continued to crumble. Business partners issued public statements distancing themselves from him. The Thompson Company's stock hit new lows with each passing hour. In the hospital room, Walter watched the activity around him with surprising calm. Sarah, by his side, couldn't help but admire his determination. "Are you ready for this, Mr. Thompson?" she asked gently. Walter nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "More than ever, Sarah. It's time to settle the accounts with the past and the future." As night fell over the city, everyone prepared for what promised to be one of the most dramatic days in the Thompson family's history. Long-buried truths were about to come to light, and no one knew for sure who would survive the coming storm. The ballroom at the Grand Plaza Hotel was buzzing with activity. Staff members rushed around, adjusting microphones and checking cameras. The tension in the air was palpable. In the makeshift dressing room, Walter Thompson was adjusting his tie with trembling hands. Sarah, standing beside him, handed him a glass of water. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Thompson?" she asked gently. Walter nodded, his eyes gleaming with determination. "More than ever, Sarah. It's time for the truth." "You're very brave," Sarah said, giving his shoulder a light squeeze. "No matter what happens out there, I'm proud of you." Walter gave her a faint smile. "Thank you, Sarah. Your strength has been my support these last few months." Outside, Amanda and Brenda were making frantic phone calls, trying one last move to stop the event. "No, you don't understand," Amanda hissed into the phone. "I need an injunction now. My father is not mentally fit to do this." Brenda, on the other hand, was using a different approach. "Senator, please, you need to intervene. Think of the scandal, the negative media coverage." Meanwhile, Caroline sat alone, her eyes fixed on an old family photo she held in her wallet. She traced the outline of her father's face, remembering simpler times. The national media crowded the entrance. Reporters from every major network fought for a good angle, their voices blending into a rising hum. "Is it true that Walter Thompson is going to confess to crimes?" shouted one reporter. "There are rumors of a new will. Can you confirm that?" another asked. Finally, the doors opened. Walter, supported by a cane and with Sarah by his side, walked slowly toward the podium. The silence that fell over the room was deafening. Walter cleared his throat, adjusted the microphone, and began. My name is Walter Thompson, and this is the story of my life. Not the one you know, but the truth I've hidden for decades. He opened a worn notebook and started to read. 1978, my first major deal. I bribed an inspector to overlook structural flaws in one of my buildings. Weeks later, a worker died in an accident. His name was John Park. He was 23 years old, and he had a newborn daughter. A shocked murmur rippled through the audience. Carolyn covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling up in her eyes. Walter continued, his voice heavy with emotion. I remember the day I got the news. I was celebrating the project's success in my office when my assistant walked in, pale as a ghost. Mr. Thompson, he said, there's been an accident. At that moment, I knew I had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. He paused, swallowing hard before going on. 1985, the acquisition of riverfront properties. I blackmailed the owner, threatening to expose his extramarital affair. He killed himself 2 months later. He left behind 3 children. Amanda and Brenda exchanged horrified looks. Their pale faces contrasted with the flush of shame spreading across them. His name was Robert Dawson, a decent man who made a mistake. I used that mistake to destroy him. The night I heard about his death, I drank myself into oblivion, trying to drown the guilt, but it never went away. 1992, my campaign for city council. I bought votes, threatened opponents. I used the office to push through projects that made me and my friends rich, while entire communities were displaced. With each revelation, the shock in the room grew. Journalists typed furiously on their laptops. Cameras clicked incessantly. I remember an elderly woman, Margaret Jenkins, 78 years old. She begged not to be removed from her home. My grandchildren grew up here, she said through tears. I ignored her, seeing only the millions that plot of land would bring me. Walter paused, taking a sip of water with shaking hands. His eyes found his daughters in the front row. Amanda looked furious. Brenda was in shock, but it was the look of disappointment and sadness in Caroline's eyes that hit him like a punch to the gut. He took a deep breath and continued, but the worst of all, my greatest regret, is how I treated my family. My obsession with power and money poisoned the love I had for my daughters. I turned them into smaller versions of myself, teaching them to value success over compassion, money over love. Amanda, my eldest, Walter said, looking directly at her. I remember the day you brought home your first A. Instead of celebrating, I asked why it wasn't an A+. I planted in you an insatiable thirst for perfection. Turning to Brenda, he went on, and you, my dear Brenda. When you wanted to be a teacher, I laughed. Teachers don't get rich, I said. I pushed you into politics, not because it was your dream, but because it was mine. Finally, his eyes landed on Caroline. Caroline, my youngest. You had such a big heart, so full of love, and I taught you to harden that heart, to see the world as a game where only the strong survive. Caroline could no longer contain herself. Sobbing openly, she stood up and ran out of the room. Amanda made a move to follow her, but Brenda held her back, both of them frozen by the magnitude of the revelations. Walter, tears in his eyes, concluded, I'm here today not to ask for forgiveness, but to offer the truth. And with that truth, I hope that those I've harmed can find some peace. And maybe, just maybe, my daughters can learn from my mistakes and choose a different path. The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly someone started to clap. It was Kevin, standing next to Sarah, his eyes shining with a mix of admiration and respect. That was incredible, Kevin whispered to Sarah. Your father is a brave man. Sarah nodded, tears in her eyes. He trusted me, Kevin. All these stories, he told me everything. And now finally he can find peace. Kevin took Sarah's hand, squeezing it gently. You were brave too, Sarah, standing by him, supporting him. I'm proud of you. The applause spread hesitantly through the room. Walter, exhausted, was supported by Sarah, who gently guided him back to his seat. As the media erupted in a frenzy of questions and camera flashes, Caroline stood in the hotel gardens, breathing in the cool night air. She looked up at the starry sky, feeling as if she were seeing the world with new eyes for the first time. Dad, she murmured to herself, why did it take you so long to tell us the truth? Inside the ballroom, Amanda and Brenda remained seated, stunned. The empire they had coveted so much suddenly felt like it was built on quicksand. What do we do now? Brenda whispered to Amanda, her voice trembling. Amanda, still in shock, just shook her head. I don't know. Everything has changed. As the night wore on, the world began to digest Walter Thompson's shocking revelations, and for everyone involved, it became clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The truth, as painful as it was, had finally come to light, leaving in its wake an uncertain but potentially redemptive path. The silence following Walter's revelations was broken by the sound of the door opening. Caroline entered, her eyes red, but with a surprising calm on her face. She walked up to her father and, to everyone's astonishment, took his hand. Walter, visibly moved, squeezed his daughter's hand before turning to George Hawkins, his lawyer. George, please proceed with the reading of the will. George cleared his throat, unfolding an official document. I, Walter Thompson, in full possession of my mental faculties, declare this to be my last will and testament. The room held its breath. Amanda leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. Brenda nervously bit her lip. Firstly, George continued, I'm establishing the Thompson Foundation for Reparation and Social Justice. This foundation will receive 80% of my entire fortune. A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Amanda shot to her feet. This is absurd. He's not in his right mind. George ignored the interruption. This foundation will aim to repair the damage caused by my past actions, focusing on 1. Support for the families of victims of accidents in my businesses. 2. Revitalizing the communities affected by my real estate projects. 3. Scholarships for low-income youth. Brenda, pale and trembling, began to hyperventilate. No. You can't do this, Dad. I need that money, my campaign, my life. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably, revealing years of financial and emotional dependence. Caroline, surprisingly, remained calm. She looked at her father, a mixture of sadness and understanding in her eyes. George continued, To each of my daughters I leave a modest house and a lifetime allowance, conditioned on their active participation in the Foundation's projects for at least 5 years. Amanda screamed in fury. This is unacceptable. I will contest this will. You'll regret this, Dad. Walter, tired but determined, responded softly. Amanda, I hope that one day you understand. This isn't punishment. It's a chance for redemption for all of us. George went on. Sarah Matthews will be named Executive Director of the Foundation in recognition of her integrity and compassion. Sarah was stunned, tears welling up in her eyes. Kevin, by her side, squeezed her hand, proud. Jack Morrison, who had been observing from a corner, couldn't help but feel a mix of admiration and suspicion. His detective instinct still questioned Walter's true motives. Finally, George concluded, I am establishing a separate fund to investigate and compensate any other victims of my actions who may come forward in the future. The room erupted into a frenzy of reactions. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed incessantly. Some applauded Walter's decision while others criticized it as an act of excessive self-punishment. Caroline approached her father. "Why, Dad?" she asked softly. Walter looked into his daughter's eyes. "Because it's time to fix what we've broken, sweetheart. Not just the world out there, but our family too." Amanda, furious, was yelling at her lawyers, demanding they contest the will immediately. Brenda was being attended to by paramedics, still in shock. Sarah, still processing the enormity of her new responsibility, turned to Kevin. "What do you think of all this?" Kevin smiled gently. "I think your dad chose the right person to lead this foundation, and I'll be by your side if you want me." Walter watched everything with a mix of sadness and hope. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in decades, he felt like he was doing the right thing. As the night wore on, news of Walter Thompson's will spread like wildfire. On social media, in the streets, in bars, everyone had an opinion. Some called him a saint, others a madman. But for Walter, sitting in his chair, exhausted but at peace, none of that mattered. He looked at Caroline, the only daughter who had stayed by his side, and saw a glimmer of hope for the future. A future that, for the first time in a long time, wasn't defined by money or power, but by redemption and love. The days following the reading of Walter Thompson's will were a whirlwind of emotions and frantic actions. The Thompson mansion, once a symbol of power and wealth, now felt like a besieged fortress. Amanda, with deep circles under her eyes and disheveled hair, shouted on the phone with her army of lawyers. "I don't care how, invalidate that will. Use temporary insanity, coercion, anything." On the other side of the house, Brenda had locked herself in her room, refusing to come out or talk to anyone. The occasional sounds of breaking objects and muffled sobs were the only signs of her presence. Caroline, however, surprised everyone. She was seen leaving the mansion early, heading to the hospital where Sarah worked. "Sarah," Caroline said hesitantly, meeting the nurse in the hospital cafe. "Can I talk to you?" Sarah nodded, curious. "Of course, Caroline. What's going on?" I don't know who I am anymore," Caroline confessed, tears in her eyes. "My whole life was built around my father's money and status. Now, I don't know what to do." Sarah listened patiently, offering comforting words and practical advice. "Maybe it's time to figure out who you really are, Caroline, without anyone's expectations." Meanwhile, Kevin was facing his own battles. Amanda had publicly fired him, accusing him of betrayal. But instead of feeling defeated, he felt free. "I have no regrets," Kevin told Sarah that night as they walked hand in hand through the park. "Doing the right thing is worth more than any job." Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "I'm proud of you, Kevin, and a little scared by all of this." "We'll face it together," Kevin promised, sealing the pledge with a tender kiss. Walter, on the other hand, was dealing with the legal consequences of his confessions. FBI investigators were seen going in and out of his office daily. Old friends and business partners avoided him like he had a contagious disease. One particularly tough afternoon, Walter received a visit from Jack Morrison. "I'm not here as an investigator today," Jack said, sitting down heavily. "I'm here as a man who respects what you did, as hard as it was." Walter nodded, grateful for the unexpected gesture of understanding. The creation of the Thompson Foundation faced its own challenges. Sarah, new to managing large organizations, spent sleepless nights studying and planning. "It's scary," she confessed to Walter during one of her visits. "So much responsibility, so many lives we can impact." Walter smiled gently. "That's why I chose you, Sarah. You genuinely care." As the foundation took its first steps, it met resistance from all sides. Businessmen, afraid their own questionable practices would be exposed. Politicians, worried about losing donations. Even some of the supposed victims, suspicious of the true intentions behind the reparations. Brenda, after days of isolation, finally emerged. But she wasn't the same. Her eyes, once shining with ambition, were now dull and distant. "I'm leaving," she coldly announced during a tense dinner. "I don't want to be part of this redemption farce." Her words dropped like stones in the silence of the dining room. Walter tried to reach out to her, but she pulled away sharply. "You've destroyed everything, Dad," Brenda hissed. "Our family, our legacy. I hope you're happy with your clean conscience." With those words, she left, leaving behind an even more fragmented family. Caroline, witnessing the scene, felt a determination grow inside her. She turned to Walter and Sarah. "I want to help," she said simply. "I don't know how yet, but I want to be part of this." Walter felt a mix of pride and sadness. One daughter lost, another found. The consequences of a life of wrong choices continued to unfold, for better or for worse. As night fell over the city, the Thompson family, or what remained of it, faced an uncertain future. But for the first time in decades, it was a future built on truth, however painful that might be. The community center hall in Newport was buzzing with activity. Colorful banners announced the first annual event of the Thompson Foundation, and the chatter of hundreds of voices filled the air with anticipation. Sarah, looking elegant in a blue suit, adjusted the microphone on the stage. Her eyes met Kevin's in the front row, and she smiled, the wedding ring on her finger gleaming. "Is everything ready?" Kevin asked as he approached the stage. Sarah nodded, a mix of nervousness and excitement in her voice. "Almost. I still can't believe we got so many people together." Kevin took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You made this happen, Sarah. I'm so proud of you." She smiled, remembering the journey that brought them here. "We made this happen together. Who would have thought that taking care of Walter would change our lives like this?" On the other side of the hall, Walter, now using a cane but with eyes shining with determination, watched everything with a mixture of pride and humility. "Dad?" a voice called out. It was Caroline, unrecognizable in her simple dress and tied-up hair. "It's time." Walter nodded, recalling how things had changed over the past year. "Caroline, you look different," he commented, a smile on his lips. Caroline chuckled softly. "A good different, I hope. I've learned there's more to life than just appearances." Walter placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "You have no idea how proud I am of you, dear." Caroline had surprised everyone by transforming her fashion brand into a social enterprise. Her new collections, made by underprivileged communities, told stories of overcoming in every piece. "You know, Dad," Caroline began, her voice soft and reflective, "I never thought I'd feel so fulfilled selling clothes that cost 1/10 of what I used to charge." Walter laughed. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it?" At that moment, Amanda approached, carrying a stack of folders. Her face, once always perfectly made up, now displayed a natural and determined beauty. "Sorry for the delay," she said, slightly out of breath. "I've been finalizing the details for the new housing project in East Newport." Walter still could hardly believe his eldest daughter's transformation. After months of resistance and legal battles, something had changed. "Amanda," Walter began hesitantly, "I know I wasn't always, well, you know, but seeing you like this, so dedicated, makes me think that maybe I did something right after all." Amanda looked at her father, her eyes filling with tears. "Dad, She paused, taking a deep breath. "I spent so much time trying to prove my worth through money and power. But that day, when I visited the first housing project, it was like something clicked inside me." Walter hugged her, feeling the weight of years of estrangement slowly dissipating. "I never thought building homes for others would make me feel more at home," Amanda confessed, her voice thick with emotion. The sound of applause brought everyone back to the present. Sarah was starting the event. "Welcome to the first annual event of the Thompson Foundation," she began. "Today we celebrate not only what we've achieved, but the lives that have been touched and transformed." One by one, beneficiaries of the foundation took the stage to share their stories. A young woman who received a scholarship, a former homeless man who now had a roof over his head, a community that gained a new health center. Maria, a 60-year-old woman, shared her story with a trembling voice. "I lived on the streets for 15 years. I thought I would die there. But the Thompson Foundation didn't just give me a roof. It gave me my dignity back." Walter felt his heart tighten with each story. These were small steps, but significant ones. When it was his turn to speak, Walter slowly walked to the microphone, leaning on Caroline for support. "A year ago," he began, his voice trembling, "I was a different man. A man who measured success in dollars and cents, not in smiles and transformed lives." He paused, his eyes scanning the audience. "Today, I see that the true legacy isn't what we leave in our wills, but the impact we have on the lives around us. Each of you here is part of that legacy." His eyes lingered on an empty seat in the front row, reserved for Brenda. The pain of his daughter's absence was palpable. "Not all wounds can be healed," Walter continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Some scars take longer to mend, but we'll keep trying day by day." After his speech, Sarah approached Walter, tears in her eyes. "Walter, that was incredible. You really have changed." Walter smiled sadly. "I've changed, but at what cost? Brenda still doesn't want to see me." Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder. "Give it time. She'll come around when she's ready." After the event, the family gathered on Newport Beach. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. Sarah and Kevin walked hand in hand along the water's edge. "You know," Kevin said, gazing at the horizon, "when I started working for Amanda, I never imagined we'd be here today." Sarah laughed. "You mean married or helping run a foundation?" Kevin pulled her close. "Both, but mostly making a real difference." Not far away, Amanda and Caroline sat on the sand, talking quietly and occasionally laughing like they hadn't in years. "Remember when we were little and fought over everything?" Caroline asked, drawing in the sand with a stick. Amanda smiled, nostalgic. "How could I forget? I was so competitive." "Was?" Caroline teased, making them both laugh. Amanda grew serious for a moment. "Carr, do you think one day Brenda will forgive us? We'll forgive Dad?" Caroline sighed. "I hope so. But I understand why it's so hard for her. We both had our careers, our independence. Brenda, she lost everything." Walter watched everything from a distance, his heart full. A flashback came to him. He and his young daughters building sandcastles on this very beach decades ago. The innocence of those moments, lost for so long, seemed to be slowly returning. "It's a beautiful sight, isn't it?" a voice said beside him. It was Tom Morrison, a friend Walter had made during his journey of transformation. Walter nodded. "More than I deserve, for sure." Tom smiled slightly. "Maybe, but it's a start." The two men stood in silence, watching the waves. "You know," Walter finally said, "I still hope that one day Brenda will join us here." Tom placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "Time heals many things. Who knows?" "Tom," Walter began, turning to face his friend, "thank you for everything, for standing by me when I was trying to change." Tom shook his head. "You always had the potential inside you, Walter. You just needed a little encouragement to find it." As night fell over Newport, the Thompson family and their close friends remained on the beach, reluctant to end such a meaningful day. Walter, seated in a beach chair Kevin had brought, watched his daughters attempt to build a sandcastle by the light of improvised lanterns. "Dad, do you remember how you used to make those perfect towers?" Caroline asked, frustrated with her crumbling attempt. Walter chuckled softly. "The secret is in the ratio of water to sand, dear. Not too wet, not too dry." Amanda, focused on sculpting an elaborate window, looked up. "Funny how those sandcastle lessons apply to life, isn't it? Balance is everything." Amanda's casual comment stirred a moment of reflection in Walter. "You're right," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I spent so much time building ivory towers that I forgot about the truly important things." Sarah, who was sitting nearby with Kevin, leaned forward. "Walter, I think we've all learned a lot this past year about what really matters." Kevin nodded, adding, "It's amazing how life can change completely in such a short time. A year ago, I was working for Amanda, focused only on my career. And now," he looked at Sarah, the love evident in his eyes. "Now you're married to the most dedicated nurse I've ever met," Amanda teased, tossing a handful of sand toward Kevin, who laughed, dodging it. Sarah blushed slightly. "It still feels surreal sometimes. From caring for Walter as his nurse to being part of all this." Walter smiled warmly at Sarah. "You did so much more than just take care of me, Sarah. You helped us see what really matters." The sound of laughter echoed across the beach, a melody that hadn't been heard around Walter in a long time. He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the sound, etching it into his memory. When he opened them again, he noticed Tom Morrison walking toward him, carrying a box. "Sorry to interrupt the family moment," Tom said with a smile, "but I thought this might be appropriate for the occasion." He opened the box, revealing a bottle of champagne and some glasses. "Tom, you didn't have to," Walter began, but Tom cut him off with a gesture. "It's not every day we celebrate a new beginning, Walter, and trust me, this is something worth celebrating." As Tom poured the champagne, Walter couldn't help but notice how even this simple gesture seemed different now. In the past, champagne was just another status symbol, something used to impress others. Now it was a way to mark a precious moment with people he loved. "A toast," Walter said, raising his glass, "to family, to new friends who have become family, and to new beginnings." "And to lessons learned," Amanda added, her gaze meeting her father's. "To hope," Caroline added. "To love," Sarah and Kevin said in unison, making everyone smile. Tom raised his glass. "And to the true legacy we are building together." As the glasses clinked, Walter felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He looked at each face around him, his daughters, who had grown and changed so much, Sarah and Kevin, whose love had blossomed amidst turmoil, and Tom, a true friend who supported him on his journey of transformation. But there was one face missing that weighed heavily on his heart. "I wish Brenda were here," Walter said quietly, almost to himself. Amanda, who was sitting closest to him, heard her father's comment. She placed her hand on his shoulder. "Dad, I have something to tell you." Walter looked at her, curious. "I spoke to Brenda last week," Amanda revealed, her voice trembling. "It was a hard conversation, but she asked about you, about the foundation." Walter's heart raced. "And what did you tell her?" Amanda smiled softly. "The truth, that you've changed, that all of us have changed, and that we miss her." Walter felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Do you think one day—" "Give it time, Dad," Carolyn interjected, having come closer to listen to the conversation. "Brenda needs to take her own journey. But the fact that she asked, that's a start." Walter nodded, discreetly wiping away a tear. He looked out at the ocean again, the waves gently crashing onto the shore. The sound was soothing, reminding him that even the strongest tides eventually calm. "You know," he said, turning back to his family and friends gathered around, "I spent most of my life thinking that a legacy was something you left behind, something tangible like money or property." He paused, searching for the right words. "But now I realize that the true legacy is something we build every day. It's the lives we touch, the changes we make, no matter how small. It's about creating a positive impact that lasts long after we're gone." Sarah smiled, nodding. "And it's about the connections we make, the people we love, and the second chances we give and receive," Kevin added. Walter raised his glass again. "So let's have one more toast to the future we're building together, and to the hope that one day our family will be whole again." The glasses clinked once more, the sound echoing through the night. As the moon rose in the sky, casting its silver light over the scene, Walter Thompson felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. There, surrounded by his family and close friends, with the sound of the waves in the background and the warmth of love and acceptance surrounding him, Walter knew that no matter what the future held, he was finally on the right path.